Donald Trump has been told Greenland is not for sale by both Denmark and the Greenlandic Prime Minister. But the US president appears adamant to take control of the autonomous Danish territory. So, what does the future hold for the people of Greenland? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Donald Trump has put the island of Greenland in the global spotlight. With a population of less than 60,000 people, the US president claims he needs the island for international security. But his remarks are raising concern over geopolitical security and the stability of international borders.
Dawn on the outskirts of the Arctic Circle. 11 a.m. in the tiny city of Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. Fishermen still finishing the morning catch amid a snowstorm in one of the most frigid places on the planet. Temperatures here in winter regularly plummet below minus 20 degrees Celsius, yet it's Greenland, a self-governing territory of Denmark, that Donald Trump has his sights set on.
Greenland is a wonderful place. We need it for international security. And I'm sure that Denmark will come along. I think it's costing them a lot of money to maintain it, to keep it. The people of Greenland are not happy with Denmark, as you know. I think they're happy with us.
In a fiery phone call last week, Greenland's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen told Trump the territory is not for sale, but the US president appears undeterred and optimistic. He wants the island for two main reasons. Its location is the shortest route from North America to Europe, making it strategically important for defence. The US has a space and missile base on it at a place called Nasiffik. More significantly though, Greenland contains deposits of oil, gas and rare earth minerals used heavily in technology, including semiconductors.
For many here, the question isn't really about geopolitical security or about a showdown between the superpowers of tomorrow. What it is a question of them living peacefully in their own small part of this world.
We are free people here. We own this land. Trump owns nothing.
We are not dreaming. We have to build Greenland with United States, not with Denmark.
The Danish legacy here is complicated, and there are strong feelings about independence, reiterated recently by Greenland's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen.
We don't want to be Danes, we don't want to be Americans, we want to be Greenlandic. And of course, it is the Greenlandic people who decide their future.
Whether or not Trump is serious about trying to acquire Greenland for the United States, his motives hint at a much more significant shift.
So let's meet our guests. Joining me here in the studio is TRT World correspondent Joel Flynn, who sent us that report and has just returned from Greenland. In London, we have Klaus Dodds. He is a professor of geopolitics and executive dean for the School of Life Sciences and Environment at Royal Holloway. In Washington, D.C., we have Elisabeth Braw. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And in Copenhagen, in Denmark, we have Jeppe Strandsbjerg. He is an associate professor at the Centre for Arctic Security Studies. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Joel, I'll come to you first. Give us your impressions of what's going on in Greenland.
Well, I think Greenlanders in general seemed pretty bewildered by certainly the international media presence there. A number of journalists obviously descending on a very, very small population over the last couple of weeks. But they're bewildered too by Trump's comments. The idea that the United States might be interested in the island of Greenland is no surprise. They have tried to purchase it in the past, most recently Truman in post-World War II. But in the Trump context, obviously, things look slightly different, and I think there is a keen awareness of that. Ultimately, Greenlanders, from what they told me, want to be independent. They understand that there are historical links between themselves and the Danish. There are familial links as well. Somebody told me, I haven't corroborated it, but something like 20,000 Greenlanders have at one point been in Denmark. So things really do run deep. People have shared histories right across both areas. But in terms of whether they think that's realistic in the context of how much the Danes actually have to help them financially, that is the question that ultimately I think most of them come back to when it comes to the question of independence. Whether Trump would improve that, I think, is a very hard thing to know based on what we've heard from him so far. But emotionally, they are very attached to the situation as it stands. And if it was to change ultimately, I think they'd want independence. One distinction I did hear being made was that, yes, the United States has legitimate interests in trying to acquire Greenland, however that manifests itself, shipping, security, natural resources. But separating that from Trump's foreign policy is the key question. It's not just about the Americans being interested in the Arctic as a security issue or an economic issue. It's about how Trump might go ahead and deal with this situation and the way he upends foreign policy norms, and dealing with what are otherwise supposed to be allies in this situation is the real concern for a lot.
Elisabeth, to you, when this first hit the headlines again, a lot of people felt it was preposterous, but he seems absolutely serious about it.
He does. And I think we all remember when we first heard about it, which was in his first administration, and he floated the idea, and people mostly sort of smiled at it because it seemed, as you say, so preposterous and so unlikely ever to happen, because that's not how liberal democracies operate. We don't buy other people's territory these days. But as you say, he seems determined to make it happen. And the reason for it is that Greenland is obviously very strategic, does and can play an important role in the West's as the West positions itself vis-a-vis Russia and China, both countries that are focusing a lot on the Arctic. But the paradoxical thing is that this has left Denmark and Greenland itself in a very unenviable position.
Klaus, to you, a lot of people are speculating that this is all about vast mineral resources and the United States' need for them.
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, President Trump has his unique style of doing presidential business. So I'm quite certain what would have attracted him was the idea that the Trump purchase, if I can put it like that, would have been possible in his second term of office. By the way, it's worth remembering that about 45% of US territory has been purchased in some form or another. And the last purchase was, of course, from Denmark in 1917. So there is precedent here aplenty. Trump is also perfectly well aware that there is mineral potential both onshore and offshore. And I'm quite certain if some of those high net worth individuals like Jeff Bezos, Michael Bloomberg, Bill Gates are investing in companies that have an interest in Greenland, why wouldn't he be interested as well?
Jeppe, to you, just tell me, the whole issue of Arctic security, how does having Greenland help the United States in terms of its security? I'm struggling to understand that.
The US has had a military presence in Greenland since the Second World War, and everybody agrees that the US is going to have a military presence in Greenland regardless of what happens, because Greenland is seen to be crucial for the defense of North America. And the perplexing thing seen when trying to explain this from a rational point of view is that US has very wide room for maneuver already in Greenland. There's a defense agreement between Greenland, the US, and Denmark. Originally, it was between US and Denmark, giving the US very wide room to maneuver. Denmark and Greenland has had a policy of accommodating and negotiating with the US. So it's very hard to see what Trump or the US would gain from occupying, controlling Greenland that they don't already have a right to do or access to do.
Joel, to you, when you spoke to Greenlanders, how did they feel about becoming overnight American citizens? Because that's presumably what would happen.
Yeah. When you asked them about US interests, I think they made a similar sort of point in that they thought that Greenland has come a long way over the last 70, 80 years or so, and particularly the last 10. Tourism has accelerated, particularly the last few years. Airports opening, Nuuk Airport has just been opening new routes and so on and so forth. What they are ultimately concerned about, and the words that we heard repeatedly to us, were how have the Native Americans been treated? That is the example that they look to when they worry about indigenous populations, and they name
terribly is the answer.
The terribly is the answer. People stuck on reservations, and you can see sort of similar social problems as well among indigenous populations in the United States to Greenland as well. There are bigger issues around alcohol abuse. There's legacy issues to do with child abuse and mental health. Homelessness as well is quite extensive, even if it's not necessarily visible on the streets of somewhere that is wintry and cold as Greenland is. Whether Trump would come in and be able to improve those sorts of social issues, you'd have to say it is quite doubtful. But the idea that he is not going to have a positive impact on the island is not necessarily true either. He has, according to people we were talking to in the tourist sector, for instance, already had a good effect just from talking to it. International tourism numbers are up. More people are coming from outside of Europe as a result of this as well. And the accidental effects too, I think somebody mentioned to us about the idea that other countries can potentially be drawn more closely together as a result of having someone who is as adversarial as he is. So there are a raft of complicated things beneath the surface, but I think ultimately Greenlanders, as I said, they want to be independent. They have a very strong cultural identity, and I think they would worry that were they to become American, that would become diluted and subsumed within this broader American ideal and identity.
Elisabeth, what happens next then? I mean, what's Trump's next move on this?
I think we're all waiting to see what he might do, because Denmark has said, the Danish Prime Minister has said, or said in her phone call with him the other day, that Greenland is not for sale. And it was reported that that phone call didn't go very well, because she did state that Greenland was not for sale. So now Trump has to think about what he does next. But I think what is already clear is that this policy proposal, regardless of whether it comes to fruition, and if it came to fruition, it would be an extremely turbulent affair. But regardless of whether that happens, what has already happened is that Trump has introduced the concept of friendly fire into NATO. Denmark essentially finding itself at the risk of losing territory, not to an adversary, but to an ally within NATO, NATO's most important, most powerful country. And then the other thing that this discussion or this policy proposal or threat has already done is to float the idea that wealthy countries can buy territory from other countries, even if they would force them into selling that territory. And that is quite a revolutionary turn of events, and I would say a not very positive turn of events.
Klaus, what can Denmark do about this? I mean, a respected country, they are a member of NATO, they play their part internationally, peaceful, decent people, and yet their entire political dynamic is being kicked up in the air.
Well, you could also say the same about Canada. One of the things that President Trump is warming to yet again, and this was something he made clear in his first administration, he can't abide delinquency. And he's absolutely adamant that NATO partners, however legitimate, friendly, welcoming, and all the rest of it to the Americans in the recent past, have not been playing their part, and that there's been too much security and defense free riding. So one argument is that what Trump has done is deliberately destabilized Denmark and Canada to make a point about that defensive responsibility. Another argument you could pursue is that this is what great powers do, and we have to stop seeing the United States as any different from a great power like China. You could argue this is classic sphere of influence material. In other words, that what President Trump is driving at is Western hemispheric security and making sure that Greenland never has a Chinese or Russian foothold. And in essence, what he's saying is, I don't trust Denmark to carry out its military and security responsibilities sufficiently well. And then the final thing, the most provocative thing, is money. You know, at the moment, the Danish bloc grant to Greenland is about 500 million euros a year. What if President Trump turns around and said, I'll offer you $1 billion a year, Greenland? How would that be as for a starter for 10? So what I would say is, I think in this administration, you're going to see what you saw in the first administration, which is a really transactional approach to foreign security and trade policy. After all, for Trump, it's the art of the deal.
Yeah, but to you, how worried are people in Denmark then? Because this must have just sent shivers down the political spines, all your leaders.
The Danish foreign minister said that this was a foreign policy crisis, and of course this has created a great stir. But I think even more important is the sensibilities that it, creates in Greenland, and all political party leaders across the political spectrum have agreed on a statement saying we don't want to be Danes, we don't want to be Americans, we want to be Greenlanders. And this has caused a huge deal of anxiety in Greenland as well as in Denmark. And it's noteworthy that last night the Greenlandic foreign minister and the Danish defense minister announced the first sort of Arctic defense package investment for 15 billion Danish kroner. What is that? 2 billion euros, as a first step to improve the defensive capability in the Arctic. But what is noteworthy is that the friendliness with which they were presenting this give us a clear signal both to Greenland, to Denmark, and to the rest of the world that Greenland and Denmark are collaborating quite nicely in these areas and can collaborate to sort of undermine Trump's narrative that Greenlanders are running away from Denmark and would rather want to be Americans.
Joel, to you, I mean, in terms of battlegrounds geopolitically, the Arctic and Greenland, it's a very strange location for all these countries to be fighting out their battles.
Well, when you look at it from the North Pole, perhaps not necessarily. I mean, it's technically the shortest route, I think, for missiles to come, particularly from East Asia over the Arctic to the United States. So from that point of view, there is some sense in it. The hemispheric perspective as well, I think, has a lot of merit, certainly as far as Greenlanders are concerned too. I think one issue that did come up when we were there was the cost of accessing these supposed natural resources that exist under the ground. Climate change is fundamentally shifting the landscape in a way that is going to make them more accessible, but you're still talking about huge overheads for investment. We know that there are Chinese companies that have mining licenses there that haven't been using them, presumably because the costs looked so prohibitive in the wake of that. And whilst the natural resources are becoming more accessible now, people have known about them for a long time as well. So it's not like this is a new facet to the conversation. This is something that has been there for quite some time. Then you have very little infrastructure in Greenland as well. There aren't train lines. There are very few airports, even though they are being built. The weather is difficult to be in, let alone to operate heavy machinery and the sort of sophisticated tools that would be needed to actually get these things out of the ground and then transport them across. And then the ports as well, those aren't really of the size that you would expect for the United States' interest to materially change as a result of the money it was getting. So you have to factor all these things in. And I think ultimately the impression that we came away with was that most people there that we were encountering seemed to think that this was a vanity issue for Trump. It was not necessarily something that they didn't think was going to change the financials as far as they were concerned. They welcome US economic interest and businesses to come there. Greenland is open for business, they said more than once. But in terms of the fundamental differences and why this is happening now, people would roll their eyes at it.
Klaus, to you, is this a vanity project then for Trump? We know the size of his ego. We hear it, we see it. Is acquiring Greenland just a big ego trip?
I would sort of hesitate to sort of confirm that, because I think, look, there's no question President Trump has, like many presidents and prime ministers, an ego. And I said earlier, I genuinely think if he thought the Trump purchase would lead to an extraordinary expansion in the territory of the United States, he would absolutely grab it. He's fascinated by maps. And I no doubt, the Mercator projection, of course, makes Greenland look even larger. But I also think if you listen carefully to what Trump has said as well, he's actually broadened this conversation out. So as I've already mentioned earlier, he's targeted Denmark and Canada as part of a broader assault on NATO parties in terms of playing their part in terms of percentage GDP contribution to defense. He's made observations about the Panama Canal, which emphasize shipping lanes and the security of shipping to and from the United States. He is deeply aware that China and Russia are working ever more closely with one another in the Arctic, as will be many of his national security advisors. And of course, he will be concerned that if, for example, the Panama Canal became inoperable because of drought or whatever, then there is a likelihood that more ships will consider going around the top of the North American landmass, and therefore there would be an interest in making sure that Greenland remains safe and secure. But the point's been made earlier by Jeppe, and it's really a powerful one. The United States has considerable defense and security latitude in Greenland already. So if, for example, the mineral element is not cast iron, if the security guarantee to a certain extent is already there, then yes, it is perfectly reasonable to say there is a kind of vanity project element to all of this. But I just caution that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact we have other great powers on territorial maneuvers as well. Russia, Ukraine and beyond, China, of course, Taiwan and South China Sea. So my slight concern is that actually this might be also about great power posturing. And unfortunately, Denmark and Greenland end up being collateral damage. I suspect that must be a worry in Copenhagen and Nuuk.
Elisabeth, you're nodding in agreement. I mean, what can Denmark be doing? Reaching out, building relationships, or is there a grim reluctance that this might happen?
Denmark is in a terrible position, frankly. No ally of the United States wants to be in this position, would want to be in this position. And Denmark is obviously a small country. We saw just a couple of days ago, Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, invited her counterparts from Sweden, Finland, Norway, for dinner, and they had a lovely meal. And the point was not just having a lovely meal together, was putting out a photo that totally demonstrated the power of friends and allies. They looked like a happy family having a lovely home-cooked dinner together. That's what allies are about. And it was clever messaging by Denmark and Sweden, Finland, and Norway. And clearly, that won't be enough to put off this affair if Trump decides to pursue it. But Denmark has a few other tools at its disposal, and I would just highlight that Ozempic is huge in America. It's saving lots of Americans who are overweight. It is so incredibly popular that there is a shortage of it. If Denmark were to say, were to ban Novo Nordisk, the manufacturer of Ozempic, from exporting to the United States, that would not be popular in the United States because it's such a much used weight loss drug. I'm not suggesting that Mette Frederiksen will take such a decision, but I'm saying that Denmark has companies that make products that Americans love, and it might be worth reminding the American public of those products and how much people would miss them if they were not to be available anymore.
And tell me, Jeppe, do you think this whole situation might embolden a move for complete Greenlandic independence, that Denmark gets pushed out of the picture completely?
I think this creates a lot of concern in terms of what independence means. Independence has been on the agenda for a very long time, for years. And for a long time, it has been a struggle for recognition to be an equal partner vis-a-vis Denmark. And there's some, there are political parties in Greenland that see this interest from the US as a great opportunity to bolster the independence claim. But there's certainly a majority across the political spectrum that also say, hey, we have to be careful. This is not, we haven't fought against Denmark for 50 years to become part of the US. And one of the things that we should all, when you look at the Greenlandic population, it's an incredibly collectively minded society. There's no private property over land. It's in many ways an antithesis to American society. If you look at how people vote and what they say in surveys, they really value welfare, state benefits free healthcare, that works free schooling, that works all these things that you associate with the Nordics. And they combine this with an American identity, but they certainly do not want to be part of a US society as it's working now.
Final point, just briefly to Joel. Did you get an impression, Joel, obviously living standards, everyone would like better living standards. Did you get an impression from speaking to Greenlanders that if a Trump takeover results in more money at the end of the month, better food, better education, better medical care, they would go for it?
I think just to pick up on that last point, you have to remember that this is a collective people that have a very long generational memory as well, and they are incredibly attached to the land itself. The idea of exploitation at to the benefit of their own personal profit is, I think, anathema to what they consider this place to be. And I think that would be very, very hard for them. Of course, they want living standards higher. Of course, they want to have things that make their lives easier. But at the price at which it might come, I think that's the bottom line. The other thing I just want to say is that the precedents that this could set at a time when the United States is ostensibly still defending the question around Taiwan, when it's still leaving a question mark over the issues of Ukraine as well. This is something that's going to feed into the international narrative. If Trump can acquire these places with money, the Chinese could well say, well, why can't we acquire Taiwan? The Russians may well say, well, why can't we acquire elsewhere as well? So,
Joel, thank you. And to Klaus, Elisabeth and Jeppe as well, thank you all so much. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.